On the morning of March 27, 1993, a woman named Mrs. Chan packed her entire life into 2 suitcases and walked out of an apartment she had lived in for 31 years. The apartment had no windows. The hallway outside was so narrow 2 people could not pass each other. She had never once paid rent to any government on earth. And the city she was leaving, it was about to be erased completely. Not relocated, not renovated, erased. Kowloon Walled City was 6.5 acres of land, 33,000 people per acre. It was the most densely populated place in the history of human civilization. And almost nobody who went to school in the West was ever told it existed. Here's what they definitely did not teach you. This city operated for decades in a legal black hole that both Britain and China created, and then both refused to fix. It had its own unlicensed dentists, its own factories, its own brothels, its own noodle shops, and its own internal power grid. The police rarely entered. When they did, they usually left quickly. 100% of the city was built without a single approved architectural plan. Now here is where it gets stranger. The British seized Kowloon in 1842 during the First Opium War. But when they negotiated the new territories lease in 1898, they accidentally left out this one tiny walled enclave. China kept jurisdiction on paper. Britain kept physical control of the surrounding territory. Nobody controlled the walled city itself. That accident, a single bureaucratic oversight in a colonial land deal, created a fortress of ungovernable space that lasted nearly a century. By the 1970s, the triads ran its lower levels. The upper floors belonged to ordinary families. Somewhere in the middle were fish ball factories running 24 hours a day, unlicensed medical clinics charging a fraction of legal Hong Kong rates, and children playing on rooftops that were essentially connected to every other rooftop in the city. The buildings had merged. There was no longer a distinction between one structure and the next. It had become one single organism. British architects who studied it after demolition called it a case study in spontaneous urban complexity. The residents just called it home. If this is the kind of history they buried in your education, subscribe right now. We cover the stories that got left out on purpose. Now here is the detail that recontextualizes everything. When the Hong Kong government finally announced demolition in 1987, they did not storm the place. They could not. Instead, they spent 5 years negotiating with individual residents. Family by family. Business by business. They offered compensation packages. They offered rehousing. They held hundreds of meetings inside a city that technically had no legal address. The operation cost the Hong Kong government over 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars just in relocation payments. For a city that was supposed to not exist. The actual clearance began in January 1993. It took 14 months to move everyone out. On the day Mrs. Chan left with her 2 suitcases, she was one of the last 300 residents still inside. By the end of March, it was empty. 50,000 workers then moved in to tear it down. They found things inside that no one had documented. Hidden courtyards. Passageways so low you had to crawl. A temple to Tin Hau, the sea goddess, that had been operating continuously for over 200 years. They carefully relocated that temple. It still exists today. The demolition was completed in April 1994. The entire site was converted into Kowloon Walled City Park, which opened in December of that same year. Clean paths, manicured gardens, elderly people doing Tai Chi where the fish ball factories used to run through the night. But here is what the park cannot tell you. The people who left did not simply dissolve into Greater Hong Kong. A significant number of them had spent their entire lives inside those walls. Some had been born there, grown up there, raised children there. The outside city, the legal one, was foreign to them. The noise was different. The space was disorienting. Several former residents interviewed in the years after demolition said they felt the loss the way people feel the loss of a person, not a building. One former resident, a man who had run an unlicensed bakery for 22 years inside the city, told a journalist in 1995 that the walled city had its own culture of trust. You knew your neighbors completely. You had to. There was no space for strangers. He said, and this is remarkable, he had never once locked his door. That detail matters more than it sounds. The place the outside world called dangerous, lawless, a den. The people inside called it the safest place they had ever lived. Because everybody knew everybody. Because the community had, over decades, developed its own rules, its own codes, its own enforcement. Not the state's rules, their rules. What Kowloon Walled City teaches us, and why it still matters today, is that human beings will build civilization in any space they're given. Or any space they're not given. It proves that governance and community are not the same thing. The absence of one does not destroy the other. In fact, in Kowloon's case, the absence of official governance may have been exactly what allowed the community to form. Urban planners still study it. Architects cite it. And yet almost no history curriculum on Earth includes it as a serious subject. That is not an accident. The story of Kowloon Walled City is uncomfortable for governments because it raises a question nobody in power wants asked. What else are people capable of building when the state gets out of the way? 100,000 people built an entire civilization in 6.5 acres. They ran it themselves for half a century. And then one morning in March 1993, they packed their bags, walked out into a city that had always ignored them, and the walls came down. If you want the history they decided not to put in textbooks, subscribe. We are just getting started.